Did he just blurt it out?
We were laying in his bed. He told me that he killed her. I was promised never to say anything.
Our story begins in the small town of East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. At 7:30 p.m. on June 2, 2011, East Stroudsburg 911 received a call from an employee of a waste disposal business. The worker told 911 that he discovered the body of a coworker hanging in a trailer. Local law enforcement was dispatched to the location, and EMTs arrived shortly after. The name of the business was Christian Waste Services. Police are escorted to a refrigerated box trailer that had the side door open. When looking inside, they are met with a horrific sight. A young woman was hanging from the ceiling of the trailer. Her knees were bent and her boots were dragging on the floor. She was clearly deceased as rigor mortis had already set in. She was found hanging from an electrical cable. The cord was knotted multiple times and tied in different ways to a bracket on the ceiling of the trailer. It appears that she leaned into the ligature and suffocated herself. Based on the scene, there was every indication that this was a suicide. The employee that called 911 identified the body as Kristen Wagner. The employee said that she had been working there for a few years. She was tasked with painting the inside of the trailer and restoring some office space. The employee got back to the yard at around 7:30 p.m. He noticed that the door to the trailer was left open. When he walked around, he initially thought that Kristen was standing there. He approached the trailer to tell her that they were locking up the yard. That's when he realized that she was hanging and was deceased. He informed detectives that he first called the owner of Christian Waste Services, a well-known local businessman named Jim Bidwell. Jim told him that he was 2 hours away in Philadelphia and directed him to contact the police. While investigators photographed the scene, finding no signs of foul play, a car speeds into the junkyard. The man was upset and trying to get through the scene to see Kristen. He identified himself as Kristen's brother, Donald Wagner Jr., or DJ. DJ's father had received a call from Jim Bidwell saying that Kristen was deceased. Before the phone call ended, DJ was already out the door. After pulling into the parking lot, he approached an officer. After DJ had identified himself, the officer said, "I'm so sorry, but we're going to need you to identify the body." DJ said, "Do I really need to go back there?" The officer said, "Well, she has a tattoo on her hips. Can you describe what it is?" DJ said that Kristen's tattoo was of her children's names. One of the detectives told DJ that it looks like a suicide. DJ said that losing Kristen did so much damage to his family. Kristen's sister Kimberly Tucker said that she received a call from her brother who was hysterical. Kim said that it was difficult to comprehend the loss. She said that losing Kristen was the hardest thing she had ever gone through. As Kristen's family shares more about her past, investigators learned that growing up in Philadelphia's suburbs had its challenges. You know those annoying promotional mailers you receive from every credit card company known to man? Well, with the sponsor of today's video, Aura, I'm here to tell you that you don't have to get those junk mailers forever. With Aura, your name, address, and phone number are proactively removed from telemarketing and mailing lists. This is just one of the many features Aura has to offer. Aura is the one-stop solution to financial, identity, and digital security. Aura offers a suite of features, there are too many to name them all, but the ones that stand out to me as the reasons why I use their service are their social security number and personal information monitoring, as well as their credit monitor. With our ever-increasing digital footprint, it's great to have Aura watching your back. Add Aura to your cyber defense arsenal today with a 14-day free trial using the top link in the description or in the pinned comment. If for some reason you don't love the service, you can cancel anytime within the 14-day trial period and pay nothing. You have nothing to lose, so start your free trial today at aura.com/crimetastic. This is also a great way to help support the channel. And don't worry, I will remind you about Aura at the end of the video so you can keep on watching. Kim said that their parents weren't always functional, but that Kristen was protective of her. Kim said that Kristen was very kind-hearted in the sense of loving children. Kristen met her husband when she was in high school and was pregnant in her senior year. She had 3 children and family was important to her, but she struggled with substance abuse issues and depression. Kim recalled walking in on Kristen in her early teenage years as she attempted suicide with pills. But in recent years, Kristen turned her life around and found solace in religion through local businessman Jim Bidwell. Jim was a close friend and business partner of her father's. Donald Wagner invested $300,000 into Jim's business. With Kristen working there, Donald saw a path for her through her religious beliefs that would get her off of her addiction. After being employed by Jim in the years leading up to her death, his influence appears to have had a positive impact on Kristen. She checked into rehab and was making progress. Family members who arrived on the scene told a story of a very disturbed young mother who had a long battle with addiction. They felt that Kristen had made the decision that this was best for her. Detectives wrapped up their investigation and transport Kristen's body to the coroner's office. In the morning, an autopsy is performed to determine the official cause of death. Signs of hanging that would be expected were found. She had a furrow or indentation in her neck from the cord. The coroner observed the lack of injury to the rest of her body and concluded that there were no defensive wounds. She was also found to have traces of narcotics and alcohol in her system, which would lend itself to the theory that she had been under the influence and had committed suicide. With that information, the examiner concluded that the cause of death was hanging and the manner of death was suicide. With the case now closed, 4 days after Kristen's death, her friends and family gather at the church for her funeral. Also in attendance is the owner of Christian Waste Services, Jim Bidwell. He was a beloved friend of Kristen's and he spoke at her memorial service. 1 week after Kristen's suicide, there's a shocking revelation that further disrupts this quaint church community. On June 9th, Jim Bidwell was arrested for narcotics distribution and possession. He was accused of bringing drugs up from northern Philadelphia to the local area and distributing them. While making a lot of legitimate money with his business, on the side he was involved in the drug world. Because the drug charges came from a neighboring jurisdiction, the police who oversaw Kristen's suicide are just being made aware of these details for the first time. Something immediately piqued their interest. Monroe County learned that the key informant bringing the charges forward was Kristen Wagner. Before her death, Kristen was giving information for several months about Jim Bidwell's involvement in dealing narcotics. Could Jim Bidwell's drug charges be connected with Kristen's death? The team conducting the drug investigation and those investigating the death of Kristen met to share information. Jim Bidwell was from the North Philadelphia area, and he subsequently moved to East Stroudsburg and met his wife. The two were heavily involved in the church community. Jim was a very well-known and well-liked man in the community. Kristen Wagner met Jim Bidwell through her father, Donald Wagner. Kristen was drawn to Jim's religious persona. She contacted him on Facebook to thank him for being a part of her father's life. She believed that Jim was a good influence on everyone. To investigators involved in the drug case, Jim is known as an aggressive individual that was involved in significant drug trafficking and narcotics distribution. 5 months before Kristen's death, Pocono police began looking for ways to convict Jim, ultimately turning to his employees. Kristen became an informant and gave information about Jim's involvement in drug dealing.
Where did he pick it up at? Who's he selling to, do you know?
We actually don't sell it. Like, everybody will give Jimmy money. And Jimmy will go get it and then bring it back and get it for them.
Is it pounds? Is it ounces?
Now,
what would you say, estimate?
one time I said, well, and it's about $18,000. You know, like, this stuff could get me in a lot of trouble. Like,
And well, that's our job to make sure that you don't.
Within a week of Kristen being an informant, Pocono police had enough for a search warrant for Jim's vehicle. Upon searching the truck, drugs were found and Jim was arrested. He posted bail and was released while the investigation moved forward. Meanwhile, Kristen continued her friendship with Jim Bidwell. Kristen's direct involvement in Jim's arrest triggered suspicion with investigators. However, her case was closed as a suicide, so detectives were left waiting for any indication of foul play to be found. After languishing in the courts for 2 years, Jim Bidwell finally has his day in court. On May 9, 2013, in a Monroe County courthouse, Jim was found guilty of possession with intent to distribute, possession of a controlled substance, and possession of drug paraphernalia. An appeal was subsequently filed, and after serving 19 months, a new trial was ordered. This was due to the court's admission of testimonies of Jim's prior bad acts and the lack of any other compelling evidence of Jim's intent to deliver. Now that he's a free man, Jim tells everybody that he's not guilty of the charges and that the next trial will show that. A year passes and the drug case hasn't yet revealed any clear connection to Kristen's death. The case continues to be deemed a suicide until investigators receive a shocking phone call. On May 27, 2014, law enforcement gets an unexpected call from a tipster who identifies himself as Rich Gerber. Rich Gerber indicated that he wanted to talk to the police about Kristen Wagner's death and how it may not have been a suicide. Rich told investigators that he was a business partner of Jim's in a business that had many layers of illegal activity. He had a falling out with Jim and decided that he was going to come forward because he was no longer going to hold Jim's secrets as his own. Jim told him that in January before Kristen's death, Jim had split up with his wife, Jennifer, and it was due to Jim's drug use, his alleged drug dealing, and his infidelities. She took both children and moved back to New Jersey to stay with her parents. At the same time, there was also a romantic affair going on between Jim and Kristen for close to a year before her death. Kristen stayed with Jim during the week because Jennifer came up on the weekends. During the interview with Rich Gerber, he disclosed that according to Jim, Kristen was sick of being the other woman. She wanted Jim to leave Jennifer. On the day of Kristen's death, she told Jim that she was going to confront his wife about their relationship. That's when Jim lost control and he choked Kristen Wagner to the point where she died. Once he realized what he had done, he took her and he hung her post-mortem to make it look like a suicide. The man giving them this information, Richard Gerber, unfortunately is well known to investigators. He has a lengthy criminal history. He also has a history of lying to investigators. With no evidence of foul play, detectives dismissed Richard's statements until they could tie it together with physical evidence. The first step was to inform the family that Kristen may not have committed suicide. With the facts of the case set in front of them, Kristen's family is reminded of the unsettling details. The fact that a suicide note was never found, even though she had 3 children. When investigators spoke further with Kim, she had a wealth of information to share, specifically involving Jim Bidwell. Kristen had confided in Kim about her relationship with Jim. Kim shares a story with detectives about Jim being at her house after the funeral. She confronted Jim about his and Kristen's relationship. He had gotten uncomfortable and left. Wanting to know more, Kim got into Kristen's Facebook and email as she knew all of the answers to her security questions. Kim handed over access to those accounts to investigators, which allowed them to confirm some of Rich Gerber's statements about Jim and Kristen's relationship. Now that investigators have confirmed some truth in Rich Gerber's statements, they can begin to re-examine evidence from the case, starting with Kristen's body. Although the investigation is reopened, the autopsy determined that it was a hanging and suicide, so that had to be changed. The problem with the case is that Kristen's body was cremated, so there was no way to physically examine it. So any examination had to be done through photographs from the scene and autopsy. Investigators reached out to a forensic pathologist and allowed her to review the information. One of the doctor's conclusions in her examination is the fact that even though there was a lack of injury to the rest of the body, the death of Kristen could have come from the hands of another person. Based on her examination, she theorized that Kristen was put in a carotid restraint, which is similar to a chokehold. This restraint cut off the blood flow to the brain and was held long enough to cause her death. Jim Bidwell was approximately 250 pounds, while Kristen was about 130. This difference in size would easily allow Jim to overpower her. The doctor asked Monroe County Coroner's Office to reclassify the death of Kristen Wagner as undetermined for further investigation. With the coroner's review, the manner of death is changed to undetermined. With the investigation continuing, detectives need to determine a motive. In this case, there are 2 plausible motives. The first is Kristen being an informant on Jim Bidwell's drug charges. If she was dead, she can't testify, and perhaps his drug charges would go away. The second motive would be the affair between Jim and Kristen, and that Kristen wanted to be more than a secret lover. Even though investigators have a motive and an undetermined cause of death, they still don't have substantial physical evidence to bring charges against Jim. So they go over the suicide case with an extreme level of detail, starting with the photos of the scene. Detectives saw what appeared to be light dust or sediment on the back of Kristen's shirt, which would be consistent with her lying in the trailer and then later hung. Detectives found the ligature itself to be odd, as it was not a slip knot, which is the most common and effective method of hanging. The only other thing they found to be unusual was the fact that her feet were on the ground. Relying on yourself to lean forward and hold yourself there is a very difficult way to hang oneself. The human body will try to save itself with involuntary movements that would have likely caused her feet to hold herself up, thus preventing her death. As detectives continue their search for the truth, Jim Bidwell appears in court for the second trial of his drug charges as well as a separate charge of patronizing prostitutes. He is sentenced to 11.5 to 23 months. Jim's incarceration was beneficial to the investigation as witnesses who were afraid of him came forward. One of those people is Jim Bidwell's wife, Jennifer. She told detectives that Jim was a devoted father and loving husband. When detectives began asking questions about Kristen being found on the business's property, Jennifer became visibly upset. She said that although she and Jim were separated at the time, they were in the midst of a reconciliation. The reconciliation, however, came with some rules for Jim. One of the conditions for Jennifer coming back was for Jim to end any type of relationship with Kristen Wagner. He couldn't help her, counsel her, or provide employment. No contact at all. During the interview, Jennifer recalls that Jim had called her on the day Kristen died.
Jim called and was crying, sobbing. I couldn't understand what he was saying, and I made out she was hanging. She killed herself. She died, and I was saying, "What? I can't hear you. What are you saying? Who?" And he said, "Kristen." He told her, "Kristen, I'm in love with her, and I can't be there for you anymore, but God will always be there for you." And she looked him straight in the eye and said, "F God." And he said that she just had this. He said, "You wouldn't believe the look in her eye. It looked so evil." And he said that was the last he saw her, and he can't believe that was her last words, and she died. My interpretation was that she hung herself because she couldn't handle the guilt of being the witness in that other existing drug charge.
Jennifer Bidwell agreed with investigators that whatever the truth was, it needed to come out. As investigators continue to seek answers, they return to the autopsy findings once more. They consulted with an expert forensic pathologist who looked at the photos from the scene as well as some of the photos taken by the coroner's office. Despite the previous examinations, the expert finds telltale signs of a suspicious death that were somehow missed. He noted that the furrow on the neck of Kristen Wagner appeared to be gray, meaning it had occurred post-mortem. Had the indentation occurred at the time of her death, it would have been yellow. Kristen also had pronounced lividity in her lower back, which wouldn't be appropriate for the position she was found in. In the pathologist's estimation, Kristen must have been lying down for some time after her death. The forensic pathologist determined that the cause of death was choking and officially changed the manner of death to homicide. With Kristen Wagner's death now labeled a homicide, detectives secured a warrant for her lover Jim Bidwell's cell phone records. They locate the call to Jennifer about the notification of Kristen's death. On June 2nd, the body of Kristen Wagner was not found until approximately 7:30 p.m. by an employee. And when the employee called Jim, he acted surprised as if he didn't know that Kristen was dead. However, his phone call to his wife Jennifer was made at around 5:30 p.m., approximately 2 hours before the body was found. On August 8, 2016, with enough evidence compiled, Jim Bidwell is arrested and charged with the murder of Kristen Wagner. After Jim's arraignment, he is held in jail without bond. This encourages even more witnesses to come forward. A woman told detectives about a comment Jim had made after the two had had sex.
Did he just blurt it out?
We were laying in his bed. He told me that he killed her. I was promised never to say anything.
Meanwhile, Jim's wife Jennifer had her own line of questioning for him. During Jim's incarceration, he made many jailhouse phone calls to his wife. And as I'm sure you all know, those calls are recorded.
Jennifer, I didn't do it. I'm not worried about them. They made lies, okay? They smoke and mirrors.
You don't understand. The case that they have against you is so solid. They have all of the phone records, and
You called me before 911 was called. You know, you lie to every single person, and they know.
I don't care what they say. I know. God knows.
You know you're my wife, right? And you have the right not to testify against me on anything.
Jim, that rule is effective except on a murder charge. Do you understand what that does to me?
Okay, well, let me tell you something. God has his hands wrapped around me, and I am so confident and sure. Put that ring back on your finger and stand by me and trust God.
What do you...
Stand by your man and trust God.
In listening to Jim's jailhouse calls to his wife, his manipulative ways were on full display.
I'm going against you because I don't know you. You've never been honest with me. You're not my husband, you're not my lover, you're not my friend. You're my only enemy in this whole world.
Jennifer ultimately divorced him while he was still awaiting trial. Jennifer agrees to cooperate with investigators, furthering their case against Jim. On February 5, 2020, 4 years after Jim Bidwell was arraigned for the murder of Kristen Wagner, his trial began. Kristen's father said that when he first walked into the courthouse, Jim nodded to him as if to say, "Hi, how are you doing?" Even with the evidence against Jim, there were still concerns that the trial may end in his favor. Jim hired the same attorney that got comedian Bill Cosby his mistrial. As James Bidwell stands trial for the murder of Kristen Wagner, his defense attorney makes a compelling case that Kristen committed suicide. The defense painted the picture of a desperate, distraught mother that had nothing to live for and only had her relationship with Jim to rely on. And that friendship with Jim was slowly unraveling due to his reconciliation with his wife. The defense spoke about her drug abuse, her mental health history, all things that in their estimation culminated in her decision to commit suicide. The defense used notes that Kristen had authored showing her suicidal thoughts. On the other side, the prosecution presented evidence of manipulation between Jim and Kristen, and how Jim used his ability to manipulate people to only see the good in him and his religion. This ultimately led to a confrontation where Kristen threatened to expose Jim's infidelity. His response was to kill her. 2 witnesses that Jim had confessed to testified under oath. They recited Jim's story of choking Kristen to death and hanging her body. On February 18, 2020, after a 2-week trial, the case goes to the jury. After a few hours of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. They found James Bidwell guilty of first-degree murder. On May 11, 2020, 9 years after Kristen Wagner's death, Jim Bidwell was sentenced to life without parole. With Jim in prison, Kristen's family is finally able to find closure for their tragic loss. Kristen's sister, Kim, said that she wants people to remember Kristen as the amazing mother and sister she was. She said that Kristen loved her children more than anything in the world, and that her kids were doing well. Kristen's father said that even as days go by, it doesn't get any easier. Remember to check out Aura with the link in the description or the pinned comment. For more videos of cases never before seen on YouTube, click one of the videos on screen now or the links in the pinned comment. Goodbye for now.